You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestel. Over the millennia, we have relied on mystics, shamans and priests to explain what awaits us in the next life. But what if all that was simply an illusion? What really lurks behind the veil that separates this world from the next? Could this world be something real and tangible, and literally not of this earth? What if the afterlife, or other types of worldwide phenomena, are an illusion created by the beings that exist within that realm? In their new book, The Deceptions of Gods and Men, Barry Fitzgerald and Brian Allan dive into the possibilities that we are all being manipulated by shadowy puppetmasters, who simply change their masks to suit the eras they appear in. Barry kindly joins me for a thought-provoking conversation. But before that, as always, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/mysteriesandmonsters or via the link in the show notes. For $4 a month, you get ad-free episodes, early releases, and bonus content. Mysteries and Monsters is also across all social media platforms: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. You can also find information by going to mysteriesandmonsters.com for links, news, and also merchandise. A big thank you as always to Dean Bestel for his marvellous artwork. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. So, let's welcome Barry Fitzgerald to contemplate if everything we know and the world around us is all just one big trick.
The Fortean Film Festival is a new celebration of cinema, created by people who have a passion for all things weird and paranormal. The current season is now open for submissions. Get involved if you're a filmmaker that has a penchant for poltergeists and adores aliens, or if you're a producer devoted to demonology with a soft spot for sci-fi. The deadline for submissions to this IMDb-approved festival is fast approaching. Go to www.forteanfilmfestival.com to submit your film or buy tickets, if you dare.
This week on Mysteries and Monsters, I am delighted to be joined by a luminary of paranormal and Fortean research, Barry Fitzgerald. Barry is well known through his working on Ghost Hunters International, Destination Truth, along with numerous other television and conference appearances. Barry, I'm delighted to finally welcome you to Mysteries and Monsters.
Paul, thank you very much for having me on. I really do appreciate it, and what a wonderful introduction.
Oh, well, I always like to ease my guests in, Barry, and make you feel as comfortable as possible, sir.
Good show.
Barry, as we were chatting before we sort of dove into this, you are a gentleman that has become quite well known in regards to your work in the paranormal.
Mm-hmm.
But I've also heard that you're also one of those people that's had the good fortune, some would say, of having an experience with the paranormal from a very early age, because you grew up in a haunted house, I believe.
That's very true. I didn't know that the house was haunted at the time. I was very young, and it was one particular night. It was Christmas Eve. And I woke up with this terrible thirst, and I wanted to go down to the kitchen. And the house itself was on a double a double staircase. It done a complete 180 on a half landing and went down into the darkness of the hallway. And as a child, I always had a habit of looking over the staircase all the way down. And this particular night was no different. And lo and behold, there was a figure coming up the stairs. Well, immediately I ran and got back into bed and forced myself to sleep because I was convinced it was Santa. So I woke up and the toys were there. So I never thought anything more of it. But it was years later that I finally confessed to my parents that I was nearly caught. And they then told me that the house had a reputation and it was known in the town. And my mother, she had seen things as well in the house, but they never ever mentioned any of this around the children. And that's really where it all began, I think. And that was the foundation stones for me to go on to do what I do.
Yeah. Do you think it's interesting that often many of us, when we've had paranormal experiences as children, Barry, we kind of create the answer that we hope it is rather than what it actually is? Like you said there, because of the time of year and what you were doing, you automatically assume it must be Father Christmas. It's Santa coming up the stairs and he's going to catch you out and tell you off and take your presents back. Whereas some people often refer to meeting kindly older people like grandparents or they have these friends that often people will poo-poo and say, oh, it's just their imaginary friend.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, Paul, that you raised that particular point. I think for me, more so than anything, I was more concerned that I wasn't going to get my action man that year. But you know, you do raise a fair point in that children do tend to see these things more so than adults. And there are various reasons as to why that possibly happens. And it's something that I often talk about, and it's something that I wrote about in The Influence that really some years ago. But you know, children between the ages of 2 and 6, their most dominant brain rhythm is theta, and that's where we tend to do a lot of our daydreaming, and that's where deep meditation would take us to. Hypnosis, suggestions, and things like that would tend to work better within the theta band. So, is there something within the brain rhythm that helps the children see that? And there's also something else to consider as well. Between the ages of 7 and 13, there's a filter that thickens over the eye. So it narrows the spectral sensitivity of the eye. So as adults, for the most part, we can't see what we saw as children. So there may be several things there to reconsider when our kids come to us and say, there's someone stepped out from the wardrobe or someone came from under the bed or whatever the case may be. They may actually be having some type of encounter that possibly as adults we can no longer appreciate.
Absolutely. I think for me, it's a very interesting phenomenon regardless, because it's one of those things that seems to be prevalent from all around the world, Barry. It's not something you can kind of pigeonhole as just a cultural reference point that it only happens in North America or Europe. There are stories from all over the world in regards to things like this. Some of them are extremely creepy. I've dealt with other stories and experiences from people who will tell me about their strange friends that their children have, and that some of them have some horrendous names, or it seems to have some awful injuries, and they seem grotesque, and yet the child seems to take this entirely in its stead. And it's an interesting aspect of the fundamental development of the realization of the paranormal. Do you think it's because children don't take things on face value? That, you know, people tend to sort of develop a dislike to certain types and aspects of people and personality as they grow older, whereas, you know, we often refer to the term the innocence of children, because to most children, everybody's just everybody else. There's no sort of, nobody's in a group or a gang or everything. They kind of take everything on face value.
I think with the encounters, Paul, and this would be across the board, both children and adults, when if the phenomena is not what it says it is, it needs to fool us. It needs to distract us. It needs to deceive us. And usually that will happen within the first 20 seconds.
Yeah.
So the body's reaction will be subdued after 20 seconds. So we become used to it. And that is a problem. Because as children, they don't know what that is. So initially, the encounter may scare them and may frighten them, but after 20 seconds, they start to settle down. And that particular reaction is tamed. That is something that we see across the board. But there are ways in which, as adults, we can certainly take back control of that situation. But for children, it's much more difficult. And as you say, you know, after a while, the child is much more forgiving. It just goes along and does its thing. But some of those encounters, as you rightly said, can turn out to be quite misleading in their own right, and that's being quite conservative. Whenever I say that, it's just one of those things. As I said, you know, the encounter itself has to be understood within the first 20 seconds.
Yeah.
And those are the signals that come through our intuition. And that's something that we need to connect to.
I find it interesting as well, because as many of us develop an interest into the paranormal, we kind of set off on a base level, depending on whichever particular case or aspect of the paranormal sort of bit us and gave us this bug, be it our own personal experiences or devouring books in the library or seeing a scary film as a child often, or a family story, Barry. So when did you start to make the jump to want to become professionally involved in this field and sort of develop your knowledge and skills?
I don't think there was ever a time whenever I said I want to do this first time. I think it just naturally happened. Yeah, because you know, there was a time in my late teens whenever I said, no, I'm not doing this. Enough is enough, and I went off on my own path. And I did rid of all the books and all of that stuff, and went off and done my own thing. And 6 months later, I was back in the path. And it was at that moment I realized this is where I'm meant to be.
Yeah, it is interesting that I think often I kind of had a very similar thing in sort of my 20s, where I kind of left it all behind and kind of looked back in it and thought, oh, well, you know, I've got other interests and all this now. And then as I've kind of matured, shall we say, Barry, it's pulled me back in probably more than it ever has in my entire life now, whether that's because of the prevalence of information that's available through the amount of books we can see, or through the streaming platforms that you can basically find a video or an interview about most cases or any particular facets of interest in this field that you want. I'm not sure, but do you think it's probably more easier now for people to kind of dive into this than it was when we were sort of growing up, where it was basically we were hamstrung by purely what we could either find in the library or the very little that was shown on British and Irish telly in those days? Yeah,
no, it was deadly back then, trying to find anything, and I'm hoping that the library would put something new in. Was always a wishful thinking, but yes, it is easier to access the information now. But I think that in itself has also been our Achilles heel, because we live in a society now where we have to have everything fast. We've got pan-held computers now that pretty much live our lives, and that in itself, when we need to know something, we quickly search it out, irrelevant of the source. And that information comes at us very quickly. And that in itself is reflected when we go and we finally engage in our early attempts to make communication with whatever we're communicating with. And the problem there being that we take the first thing that comes along and we don't question it, we accept it, and that's that. And there is a huge problem in that we're not slowing down, we're not testing what's coming through the veil. We're not understanding what's coming through or where it originates from and things like that. So there are warning bells there that we need to adhere to. We just can't jump into this with both feet. We see the outcomes of that time and time again. We see research teams that end up going in and having very little experience, and then before they know it, they're being eaten alive from the inside out, so to speak, and the teams all fall apart. And that insidious nature that has been unleashed goes to town, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it is very dangerous as well, because often, as you refer to there, it's which sources you're actually utilising to get the information, because often these days, everything's so fast and rapid that people don't usually go past the first 2 or 3 things they may come across. They kind of, that's all they'll do, and they'll get their hit that way. Yeah. Whereas perhaps, without wishing to blow our own trumpets here, Barry, I think for people like ourselves who have had a bit more worldly knowledge in regards to some of these subjects, we can kind of navigate some of the pitfalls the modern paranormal fan may find themselves falling into at that first hurdle.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see, Paul, that when we go into the likes of a bookstore or we go online and we have a look around, there are plenty of places that will tell us how to do this, what we should be asking. We lift a voice recorder and we ask, is there anyone there? Can you come forward to me? And things like that. But very little do we find of solutions when it goes wrong. And that is always a worrying point. And I've seen the outcome of this time and time again, right across Europe and other continents. I've seen this happen, where people then wonder, well, how do I get out of this? How do I stop this from happening to me?
Yeah, very much. I mean, and it also, there is so much bad data out there that often it can lead people down completely the wrong path, which could often, in certain circumstances, cause things to get worse.
Absolutely. Good science starts with observation, and the paranormal is the same. You have to observe it, you have to watch it, and you have to take time.
Absolutely. And then you've got to be able to validate a lot of things and not take things on face value, because, yeah, as we're diving into later in the conversation, your latest book, The Deceptions of Gods and Men with Brian Allan, there are numerous cases over the years, as you mention, about blackout seances and things like that, where things have been done. And anybody that's read enough about certain characters over the last 150 years can easily point to certain cases, which, when we look at them in a modern eye and a more balanced and skeptical opinion, you can kind of look at it and think, how on earth did these people get away with these kind of things?
That's it. And, there's also this case of where we want the information to be right. We want that particular connection, irrelevant of whether the entity itself or the energy that's coming through tells us 4 lies, but tells us one truth. Yeah. We'll ignore the lies and we'll take the truth and throw the lies out. And that's the hook and bait. That's what they do. And that's how they manage to anchor themselves here.
Absolutely. I mean, Ouija boards are a prime example of that. And I've heard you speak in the past that you're one of those people that has a very balanced view on that kind of communication channel, shall we say. Whereas, depending on who you go, recently I've been listening to a lot of Art Bell's old shows from his archive.
Yes.
That have kindly been put online. And it's quite funny looking back 25 years ago, where everything was a communication with the devil, and it was all leading you to a path of spiritual loss, and you were giving up your souls. Whereas people like me, who were mucking about with them in my late teens, Barry, the vast majority of information we got was either gobbledygook or nonsense. And as you say, the vast majority of it was just a tissue of lies and nonsensical ramblings most of the time.
Exactly. Yeah. My own experiences whenever I was trying to test the boards to understand how they worked, as you say, a huge majority of it was just gobbledygook. And of the clear messages that were coming through. It was interesting to observe that over the course of time that things started to degrade, and its nature started to seep from the board itself, and you could see that things had gone from a positive, happy-go-lucky aspect to there was a hint of darkness that seemed to be slipping into it, but again, with this who could beat, that tends to be ignored.
Yeah, as with anything, it becomes addictive because it starts off as good fun and people are having a laugh, and occasionally you'll get the odd message that might send a shiver up your spine. But I completely agree. In my personal experience, the more you do it, the more negative it seems to become, whether that's because you yourself begin to view the whole concept as quite a negative form of communication, or the group of people that you're with, if you're doing the same thing. As you say, things begin to seep out and affect the atmospheres, and it stops being fun. Not that it becomes dangerous, but I think it tends to start to focus on the negative aspects of communication, where it's usually gets quite threatening and angry and aggressive. Whereas at first, it might be saying that, Steve smells of poo or something like that. Whereas by the end of it, it's threatening people and saying horrible things and talking about possession and stuff. So it's a very interesting concept that I've not really thought that much about it, but when you look back at it, it is a clear path that it just begins to develop for whatever reason.
Yeah. I did see a great video there online, and it was a father, I believe, who was down in the basement, and his daughters were up in the bedroom with their friends playing a Ouija board, and he was in the fuse box switching the lights on and off, hearing the screams going through the beds. I did think that was very funny.
Absolutely. I bet he's a right laugh at Halloween. God knows where he's probably eyes in the cupboard with a rubber axe or something.
His children are going to need therapy.
Well, yeah, he'll get his comeuppance when the bill comes in as a bit. So, as your knowledge and search for answers in the paranormal have developed over the years, Barry, would you say that where you are now, as I was referring in regards to myself earlier, you're not where you thought? Did you think you'd end up following the channels that you're going down now and looking in the certain areas that you're beginning to focus on when you started looking into the paranormal and going on investigations and building a team and traveling the world to some of the most famous haunted locations?
Oh, not at all. Not at all. Things seemed so black and white back in the day. But it is far from black and white. There are many different grey areas within the research itself that just keeps this enigma rolling on. And now I'm delving into very, very ancient pathways, and that in itself is just absolutely fascinating, because from my perspective, I wrote a book there, The Banshee, and we just released the 3rd edition there at the end of March on Amazon, and we interviewed people from around Ireland who are still experiencing the Banshee, this caller of death, on the land itself. And when we started delving into the myths and legends of the land, my God, we ended up having more experiences with that than we did with the entire paranormal years before. And in fact, some of the encounters that we've had were that extreme. I said, if I ever come across that again, I'm retiring, I'm finished. Mm-hmm. But with the ancient pathway that I'm now tracking back, I have found that I've found a connection to the Banshee, which I assume was just something of this island. That's necessarily not the case, because I've found something back in Babylon in the cuneiform tablets that mentioned something almost identical. And the thing is, the people who were building the passage chambers here in Ireland before the Great Pyramids of Giza were coming from Babylon. So they may have brought this with them. And that was just an absolutely amazing find, and just blew my mind away, because it's now gone from something which was hundreds and maybe even 1,000 years old to 5,000 years old or longer.
I've often been very interested when we look at ancient civilizations from around the world. There are certain things that seem to have been with us since man has had the ability to scribe communication down in whatever form, be it the clay tablets of Mesopotamia and Samaria, and as civilizations have developed across all the great old civilizations of Egypt and Greece and Rome. There are these trends or these cultural touch points that always seem to be there. And it's not necessarily, as you mentioned earlier, black and white, good versus evil. There seems to be a continuing development. And yet over, when we're talking about Babylon and Mesopotamia, we're talking about 3000 BC. And yet here we are 5 millennia later, Barry, and some of the trends and the aspects of faith and belief and fear that they relate then all the way through time seem to be still with us, but it seems as if they're wearing different clothes. They've adapted as time's gone on.
Yeah, the different masks, but the same phenomena. And that's the way that I've been able to track them, is the way that they interact with us, not so much the face in which they interact with us using. The likes of the Greys, they don't go that far back, and fairy traditions again. They'll go so far, then they stop. But the way that they interact with us remains the same. So that's the way we're able to track back, and that is across the board within ufology, earth spirits, jinn, the old gods. There's this fine thread that seems to weave through quite a few of the top aspects of those fringe research fields. Missing time, of course, within ufology is a given. The mischievous nature of some of the encounters also makes themselves known. Abduction, mutilation, deception, of course, is a big one there. And this is something, those key points are all similar throughout the earth spirits, the jinn, and the old gods. And interestingly, and this is something that you won't hear ufologists talk about, it's their aversion to iron. They're afraid of people who wear iron. And that was interesting because that's from my own personal experience. I was able to witness that. And I've seen the aversion to iron with the earth spirits. I've also come across that, of course, within the jinn and the old god. So that is our defense, if you like, on how we can stop some of the things from happening to us that they do.
Absolutely. And it's very interesting when we talk about the missing time aspect, because for me, as someone that's really developed a love of folklore from Britain and Ireland over the last 4 or 5 years, for me, it was very interesting. The more I learnt about the Fae, the more parallels I began to see in certain aspects of ufology in regards to the key is missing time, or being fairy-led, as they used to call it in the olden days, when people would go for a wander and meet some enticing character who would promise them milk and honey or whatever delights were available at that time that would tempt these young people to sort of disappear with them. And it's very interesting that as our knowledge increases, often the more things change, the more they actually seem to be the same, if that makes sense, because there are so many parallels, like you say there, because obviously as soon as you mention iron, anybody with a passing knowledge of the Fae will know a good way to protect yourself from a wayward curse or something like that is to have plenty of iron at hand. And yet this seems to still continue today, that we have some characters, for whatever reason, have this aversion to certain metal.
They do, and it's worth pointing out as well that the Incubus, succubus attacks that happen to a huge amount of people around the world, they tend to wait until the women go into their monthly cycle.
Yeah,
so they become anemic. iron has gone out of their system. That's when they strike. And not very many people are talking about this. And it's something that really should be talked about. But unfortunately, it just seems to fall to the wayside.
Yeah. For you, Barry, because obviously your experiences was based in sort of the normal parameters of what people would consider the paranormal. Was there a case or an incident that you experienced that kind of led you to the path that's got you to writing the book, that it's kind of made you think there's more to this than meets the eye? It's not just disembodied spirits or the lost souls of dearly departed loved ones or alien visitors or whatever. Was there something that lit the touch paper and sort of sent you on your way? Because I find it very interesting that where you are now with the latest book, The Deception of Gods and Men, would be very different to, say, if you looked at what you were doing 10 years ago for anybody that's followed your career. But do you think that's because the more you see, the less you understand?
When I wrote The Deceptions of Gods and Men, I put it to one side, and I ended up going back and looked at some of the books that I had written. And I could see that those particular books slipped nicely into the subject matter of the deception of gods and men. I could see even back then that I was being steered in that particular direction. And that becomes very apparent in the books, and especially with the influence. The idea of how we understand with these entities attach themselves to us and what they're doing to us on a biological level, and how we can turn that back and how we can identify that. It really makes its appearance known within the latest book. Now, do I see? Was there something that changed my path? I would have to say yes. Probably when we started investigating the mythology and folklore on the land, that's had a great impact on me. And there was one case in particular, the Island of the Dead, up in County Donegal.
Yes.
That place was one of the most frightening places I have ever been around the world. And even though there was another person there, Cormac Strain, even though he was there and he was in another tent, maybe it was still it made such an impact on me that it lifted me off the railway tracks that I was on and set me on a new course. And when that happened, that's whenever I started to see all these other connections that I had failed to see before. And that in itself, that particular island linked me to research that stems back thousands upon thousands of years. And there's another book coming behind this, which is called The Fruit of the Gods, which has absolutely blown my mind about where it's going. I had no idea when I was putting pen to paper for The Fruit of the Gods where this was actually going to go on. It's just absolutely amazing. That's what I do now, and that's where I am. And I don't travel as much now, especially with the last 2 years. Traveling has kind of been hit on the head, and that in itself has served for me to connect back to the land again, and back to some of the influences here that has helped steer some of those books.
Yeah, I think the last couple of years have been quite reflective for some of us, because it's kind of quietened the noise of the real world out there. And we're not sort of dashing about wherever we needed to be or whatever, whether we've been working from home or the change in our personal perceptions about the world around us. It was very interesting for me when our first lockdown finished here. Living in Sheffield, I'm very fortunate to be near the Peak District. So with the first chance we could get back out, we decided to go out to the peaks and have a little walk around, and we went to one of the local reservoirs. In all my life living in this area, Barry, I have never, ever seen as many people decide that the best thing to do that Sunday morning was go and look at a reservoir. You literally, I think we drove for 3 miles, couldn't find anywhere to park, and in the end we just thought, no, I love the countryside, but not this much. It was getting too stressful. It was kind of the exact opposite of what we were trying to achieve. Yeah. So it's been very interesting that for a lot of people, because they've not had that sort of temptation to to go out for meals or to restaurants or to socializing in large gatherings, they've kind of looked around them and what's on their doorstep a lot more. And I think for a lot of people, the last 2 years has allowed them to kind of ruminate over things that perhaps they've never had the space or the quietness to really sort of evaluate and get their teeth into.
That's very true. And, you know, that there was a phenomenon that began to raise its head during the lockdowns. And I'm sure you must have heard of it in the UK. It was called pandemic dreaming. And this idea that the people who were staying at home were not using their alarm clocks. And they were working from home, but they were waking up on their own time. And that allowed them to enter their natural cycles of sleep. And as they were entering out of sleep, they were entering into this particular visionary psychic state where they ended up having these prophetic dreams, and some of them were quite harrowing as well. But in itself, it allowed them to connect back to something they had lost connection with, because this was their psyche reaching out to them now, and it wasn't being cut off by man-made interceptions of alarm clocks and everything else. And they started to experience this. So yeah, maybe it did waken them up, so to speak, and let them reconnect. I suppose they were all out trying to find some socket somewhere they could plug in. We'll see where it goes. That's all we can do. You know, we're just coming out of it now. Well, we think we're coming out of it.
Yes.
We'll see where it's all going to end up.
Absolutely. I think it was very interesting as well, because I've noticed over the last sort of 3 or 4 months, there've been a lot of articles and discussions in regards to people's paranormal experiences increasing on a variety of levels and a variety of subjects, Barry, that a lot of people have kind of said, oh, well, it's probably because people are at home more and they're not used to how their house sounds, which I think is a bit of a stretch, to be honest. But it has been very interesting. As someone that decided to quit smoking at the beginning of the pandemic, I was never a dreamer, and I've dreamt more in the last 2 years than I have in the previous 40. Yeah, by a long, long way, to a point where I can actually physically remember dreams, whereas I couldn't before. Now, maybe, you know, I find that a very odd side effect of quitting nicotine, to be honest. And yet, it's very interesting that it seems to have happened at the same time where other people, as you refer to, have had this kind of connection with their psyche that has allowed them to have more vivid dreams or to basically work on an alternative time clock.
And also you've absolutely saved yourself a fortune.
Yes. Absolutely. So it's strange how that once again, as we're talking about cultural aspects, this isn't one of those things that seems to be affecting a particular country. I've seen reports from Japan, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, the Americas, South America, Britain, where people are saying that there are more reports of certain paranormal phenomena. Do you think that's because, you know, as I say, you know, I wasn't trying to be churlish. I think some people would, you know, a ghost could throw a cup in their face and they'd write it off as a bad wind. Barry, you know, often some people, they can't see the wood for the trees regardless of what's happening in front of them. Do you think people have simply just become more open to it once again, as you were referring there about pandemic dreaming? It's kind of opened their minds a little bit more to make them a more receptive vehicle for whatever's going on.
It's possible. There's also another aspect to it in that this is our psyche, psyche, soul, whatever you want to call it. It's that reaching out to us to tell us that there's something coming. And at that particular point in time, you know, if we were to say, well, it was the pandemic, we were in the midst of the pandemic, and these dreams were coming to warn us of something coming. So whatever it is, it hasn't arrived yet.
Absolutely. I mean, some would say perhaps the noise of the real world was drowning out. Perhaps it would be interesting looking back to see if there was a spike, sort of the end of 2019, as we all sort of sleepwalked, as it were, into 2020 and the problems that were about to land across the world very quickly. It was quite remarkable to to look back at the news and think what was going on in China in January. And then 9 weeks later, I was working from home.
Well, it was interesting because, in 2019, I was flying back from Utah, and I was just getting back into Ireland whenever this was all unfolding. And at the time, a lot of the sensitives, psychics, mediums, call them what you want, they were blinded per se by this news drive that was constantly talking about Brexit this, Brexit that. It was always Brexit. Every time you turned on a news channel, it was always Brexit was always being mentioned. Yet a lot of them knew something was coming, but they were being blinded by this particular news media that kept hitting Brexit. I wondered to myself if Brexit wasn't there, if Brexit happened and there was hardly any mention of it, would they have picked up on what else was coming?
Yeah.
And I think they would.
Interesting. I mean, it is often the case when situations like that, people can't actually focus because, as you say, there's too much chatter going on.
Yes.
And maybe, as you say, that kind of blindsided a lot of people, which I think most of us did. A lot of people kind of didn't think much of it until it turned up on their doorsteps. And it's one of those, it'll never happen. It's one of those things that, as a student of history, Barry, it's remarkable. 100 years on, we seem to just carry on as though the Spanish flu had never happened.
Yeah.
So, as you were saying there, when you actually wrote the book and then kind of put it down for a couple of years and reached out to Brian Allan, who's a very well-known Scottish researcher in both the paranormal and ufology. In regards to the subjects that you were focusing on, what was the kind of ideas behind this collaboration? Because obviously this book is co-written with Brian. So was it a question of having another point of view or to utilize Brian's experience and knowledge of certain subjects? Because once again, he's someone else that has spent his entire life investigating strange phenomenon, primarily because of an experience he had as a child.
Well, certainly from Brian and I's perspective, it wasn't necessarily that we shared similar perspectives and things like that. It was we still are very good friends, and we would laugh from time to time. We say we're the Celtic brothers across the divide, and we chatted back and forward, and we rolled the ideas of writing a book and together. And I said, well, look, Brian, I've got this one and I'm well on with it. Would you consider coming in with that? And he said, yeah, let's do it. And that was it. There was no other reason behind it. And Brian, you're right. Brian does have a long list of books that he has published, and he's a producer, of course, of the Phenomena magazine.
Yeah.
He does a lot of work within the field. Not so much field visits anymore, because like all of his age is coming on to us.
Yeah.
But he definitely still has his fingers in many pies, and he really covered the AI aspect. I think it was the second chapter from the last. He really got delving into that, and I welcomed his inputs in that. It was fantastic. I loved the way it finished off.
Absolutely. I mean, I really find it quite interesting because there is a real sort of theme that runs throughout the book, and you kind of take us from there. I was delighted to see the first chapter focuses on one of my favourite Fortean cases, which is the very strange case of the Reverend Robert Kirk.
Oh, yes.
Which is one of those that I think often people might look at it and can go, oh, well, it's the end of the 17th century that everybody thought witches were everywhere and all that. But the Reverend Kirk's experiences are quite well recorded, primarily because of how it ended up completely taking over his life and essentially ruining him as a professional man in his local standing. People didn't believe anything. So for anybody who's unaware of this incredible story, could you kind of introduce what on earth was happening for the Reverend Kirk?
Reverend Kirk was an exceptionally intelligent man, and he had translated the Bible from Latin into Scotch Canadian. Well versed in biblical matters, and so he ended up having this parish just outside Glasgow. But within the parish, there was this place called Doon Hill, and it was there that he made. During his many walks around the particular parish, he made contact with what we nowadays would associate with the fairy. And in Scotland, they were known as the Seelie. But there were within the Seelie camp, there were two different factions. So you had the Seelie and you had the Unseelie, and the Seelie absolutely love the human race, and all they want is our adoration, and they will try and help us to do the best they can. But the Unseelie do not like us whatsoever, and they do not care whether we live or die. Now, this particular aspect of the story is by no means new. This is something that goes back thousands of years, being retold time and time again. This broken record keeps appearing. And sometimes twice in one generation. And it keeps coming back and back and back. And I don't know what it is about the human race, but we just don't seem to get it. And of course, for Reverend Robert Kirk, he ended up becoming involved in their conflict. And that unfortunately cost him his life. And he tried to speak to the Unseelie and bring some type of order, but that was not required. They did not want his help, and in fact, he overstood boundaries, unknowingly overstepped boundaries, and of course, he had to. He was given two options, and he had to go with them. They say that they found his body on the hill. Some say he died of a heart attack. Others say it was a changeling that was left. Either way, the body was buried in the church, and that's where it lay today. Now, whether it's him or not that's buried there, we will never know. But it was the story itself was what fascinated us about the story. Was this broken record, which was something that we saw throughout history about it's about this phenomena coming through into our world, our reality. It was of the same coin.
Yeah. I think that is a very interesting aspect of the book, is that there does seem to be this theme, as you say, that we just don't seem to look back and pick up on what's going on. And as you've referred to in the book, you know, regardless of which civilization or period of history, there are these parallels that seem to constantly keep reoccurring over and over and over again, regardless of which denomination people follow or which civilization you look at. That there seems to be something, as you refer to it, beyond the veil. There's something there for whatever reason that, as we were talking about the encounters that children have, something that makes itself palatable and approachable.
Yep.
And yet, clearly, these beings, this intelligence, this shape, this concept is essentially a deception.
Oh, very, very much so, very much so. And, you know, there are certain basic tech that they tend to use and incorporate within this. And the Italian case that we speak about as well is they appeared wearing this outfit. This particular faction wore the outfit, and all they wanted was our adoration. But here's the thing: the suit itself absorbed this adoration that we were feeding it, and it sent it back it reflected that back to us, and we picked that up, and it overrode our natural sense of fight or flight. So again, within the first 20 seconds, we're knocked out of the game. But this is something really to consider, because the suit itself is what we were picking up on, not those in it. That aided them to hide their true nature within that encounter. And that's something we talk about within the book, you know, that Italian case, and how that went on to really become, really make this great connection. And this of course, this connection that we made with some of the material that they were requesting, the industrial amounts of material that they were requesting of us, for whatever purpose. And during one particular New Year's Day, he had taken a photograph of 4 UFOs that appeared outside a restaurant that he was sitting in California. Now, the photographs are that clear that you could actually see the hull plates on these ships. But more interestingly were the color that these craft were emitting, because the color also reflects, when we cross-reference the periodic table, of the metals that they were asking for in Italy 50 years before. So there may be some connection there, the actual metals and the fact and the way that they're being heated and the way they're being presented and how we're seeing them. And that high, of course, that high heat that will be used to burn that particular metal, it in itself could also produce that radiation that causes the burns that we often hear about within UFO encounters.
I mean, it is very interesting because as you go through the book, you look at different types of phenomena and different aspects of it. And as I was saying before we started the interview proper, Barry, it was interesting for me as someone that's read a lot of Keel and Jacques Vallée, that there are aspects of this book that really reminded me of some of the points and considerations that they began to sort of look at, that it's not a one-size-fits-all phenomenon. It's not different aspects of different phenomenon. There is something intrinsic that seems to be linking them, be it some kind of cosmic trickster or some dark entity lurking in the shadows, attempting to sort of change its mask as time goes on and pretend to be something else, as we were saying earlier on about the parallels between the Fae and abduction cases in ufology, and obviously some of the work that, for example, David Paulides has done with Missing 411, where people vanish into thin air, it would seem, in some cases, which are quite frightening. I think the one that always gives me the chill is the children playing hide and seek, and one of them simply vanishes.
Yeah, David's work crossed over into mine very neatly, and I was very surprised by that. Because we tended to spot a lot of the hotspot areas using the satellite technology, both north and south of the hemisphere. So before we went to a location, we could see which particular magnetic anomaly was present within the area or close by. And with David Paulides' work, his groupings of people that went missing within certain areas all fell within strong magnetic anomalies. And you will also have a connection with rocks with this phenomenon, whether it be rock strata, or cliff faces, caves, whatever the case may be, they always seem to be pretty close to water. Their origins are very close to water, rocks. And even when we go back and we look at the likes of mythology and folklore, within England, you've got that title, the what's it called? Gremlin? No, Goblin. That's the one. The Goblin in itself, of course, was a terrible trickster and an ugly character in its own right. But that originated from the Middle French Gobelin, which originated from the old Germanic Kob, which transfers into hole in rock. So we're full circle back to the rock again. We're never that far away. And whenever we go back and we look at these places in which our ancestors, the people who have built Stonehenge and things like that, we're back into rock again. And the Neolithic passage chambers that dot the British Isles and most of Northern Europe, they also were made out of rock. So there was something about this phenomena coming through the rock. And, we spoke about the Banshee earlier. Within the Irish tongue, the Banshee means woman of the she. And for a lot of people, they believe that the She were the fairy, but that's not the case. The She are actually the mounds. So it's a woman of the mounds. So they're coming through the rock. I've had experience where I've seen that particular phenomenon happen. And it is quite bizarre to witness. So whatever it is about the rock, and that's something which we're still trying to understand. There's an expedition being planned this year, hopefully, which is going to answer some of those. But it's something that's still ongoing as to why are they connected to the rocks, and why do they want all this blasted metal that they've been taking? More and more questions as we go along. We think we're getting answers, and the more answers we get, the more questions we have.
Which is the most perplexing thing about it, as we were sort of jousting earlier. And you see, the more you seem to discover, the less we actually know, it would seem.
Yeah.
That's one of the key aspects of this. And obviously, some people will discuss what they know known as the Trickster Phenomenon, where because things are so strange, and you can apply this to all aspects of Fortean phenomena, there will always be cases where strange things happen, where people sort of have a Bigfoot encounter, and yet when they describe it, it seems like they're talking about a ghost, and yet it doesn't act like a ghost. It, to all intents and purposes, on face value, they're saying it's a Bigfoot, but then it vanishes. Or you have strange alien encounters, as you were saying, like the one in Italy, where they were basically, asking for ludicrous things.
Yeah.
And there will always be cases like this where you sometimes you just scratch your head and think, what on earth is going on here? Because even in the parameters of the strange phenomenon that we all love, there will always be these cases that turn up. You could even probably say that the Mothman flap, because the whole Mothman flap that sent Keel on his way to the world of high strangeness, the Mothman itself is a very strange aspect of that, and yet it's only a tiny portion of all the weirdness that was going on, because there was lights in the sky, there were strange visitors who didn't seem to be quite right, there were strange areas of fear that you could walk in and out of. People would disappear, doppelgangers were happening, and yet if you look at that on face value, people go, oh yeah, this creature was flying about. But that's a tiny portion of it. The rest of it is for me, has always been the meat and potatoes of Keel's work, rather than the creature that seems to have been the starting point for it.
When you start getting close to it, start looking back, and that became prevalent and very apparent to me. Whenever I was in the United States, I was over the East Coast, and we had a meeting, and it was in a diner actually, and it was a late night meeting, and I think we were finishing up around 3 a.m. and the discussion topic was the high strangeness and what was going on behind that particular mask and the possible agenda behind that. Now, I'm not going to name names, but there were a lot of very good people involved in that particular meeting. But when it had ended, we were driving back to the hotel, and I was a passenger in the car, and we drove past this factory that sat on the edge of the road, and I remember glancing in at it, and on top of the concrete thing to protect you from rain, and the cover above the door was sitting this huge black gargoyle creature thing. And I remember looking at it going, wow, that's a strange thing to have in your building. And I never thought anything more of it because I was tired. I wanted to get back to the room because we were leaving the next day. And but I remember at the time thinking, wow, that was quite a thing to have. And the next morning when we left, we drove past the factory again, and I looked, and it wasn't there. So I'm not quite sure. I really don't know what I was looking at per se. I've went back to try and think about that and understand it, but I just kept, because even though I was tired, I was very wide awake. but I just couldn't explain it. But I do know that when you start treading on their toes, they start pushing back. And that's something that I see right across the board.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously very interesting as well. I know in the book you look at certain aspects throughout history where we have this kind of concept of shining or shiners or light being some kind of sort of beacon, pardon the pun, Barry, to kind of, it seems to be attractive to certain people that often in life we will meet people who we think give off some kind of resonance, or they seem to, people gravitate to them for whatever reason. And yet when you're looking at this, you're saying that when you've been doing your research and looking at some of these aspects, this is one of the key things that whoever these characters are, this is what they're looking for. Yeah.
And whenever I wrote the book, The Influence, I was given a warning at the beginning of that. And the warning came as, don't become too bright or they see you. Now, I often wondered, years went by, and I thought, what on earth was that about? And I of course, was informed on a series of experiments that were conducted right across the world on EVP. And the same question was being asked time and time again, how do you see us? And each time it kept coming back as light. And then the warning that I was given whenever I was writing the book, but these particular beings that produce their own light, they are my nemesis. And that in itself is something which really amazed me whenever I started delving into it for that particular book. And this idea that the shining ones and where they come from and how far we can track them back. It was a travel adventure, if you like, to be part of, to track this down. But again, it's the first 20 seconds that tells the tale. It tells the nature of what we're encountering. And the likes of Lourdes, for instance, in France, we have Saint Bernadette, who saw this being within the mouth of a cave system, a typical place for them, appear. Now, in the initial stages, before the church got to it, the church, of course, had the influence in which it then smoothed out Bernadette's encounter, and later she became known as the Lady, Our Lady. But that wasn't what Bernadette encountered at the beginning. And even the statues that were created for Our Lady, when she saw them, she said, that is not what I saw. That was something that was to haunt the church. Because they wanted this cash cow, and that's what it was, and that's what it is today. But when, in her words, when she referred to this being, it was smaller than her. Now she was 4'7", and this particular being, whenever it appeared, was wearing white and emanated this golden color from behind her, and she seemed to glow, but she mimicked. And she had the rosary in her hand, and she was mimicking what Bernadette was doing. And Bernadette referred to her as that thing. Hardly something that because Bernadette didn't know who the hell she was looking at or what she was looking at. Again, within the first 20 seconds tells a lot. But that particular encounter, of course, was smoothed out. An American lady, Kathy, she was there at Lourdes. And she was hoping for a really wonderful time. Instead, her instincts and her guides were screaming at her, get the hell out of here. And she pleaded with the people to let her go. They really did want her to be part of this whole ceremony in which she bathed in the muddy water and everything else. But that is not what she wanted to be part of. Her instincts were telling her to get the hell away from this. And that spoke volumes, that she was able to listen to this sense that we all have, but very rarely listen to these days. And that sense was telling her to get out of there.
Absolutely. There's some interesting parallels as well with Lourdes, with what happened in Fatima in Portugal in 1917. Barry, I've often found this really interesting that once again, we have the official doctrine version, and this is something I only discovered about 5 years ago, that there are allegedly photographs that the Vatican have that they won't release, which I find very odd, that if this was supposed to have been this miracle.
Mm-hmm.
As you say, before Lourdes became what it is now, there was no description of angels or anything like that. It was just a thing.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that in Fatima, this is another thing that people were seeing things. And obviously, once again, is it the perception of what is acceptable to the human mind to see that they then believe that what they are seeing is what they want it to be rather than what it actually is?
Well, as I said at the beginning, it's the hook and bees.
Mm.
And Medjugorje is another perfect example there. Back in 1981, 6 children observed her.
Mm.
And I have to point out that they were frightened, exceptionally frightened. And that was within the first 20 seconds. That speaks volumes. And it stuns them that they can't move. Again, you see this common factor within ufology and abduction scenarios and things like that. And there is a wonderful book out there by Jeremy Black and Anthony Green, and it's called In Gods, Demons and Symbols of Ancient Mesopotamia. They state in the book that in ancient Mesopotamia, the gods exuded melam and nai. Melam was a light that was terrifying and awe-inspiring, whilst nai was described as a creeping of the flesh. Same phenomena, different mask.
Yeah, it is strange. I know one of the other deeply interesting cases that you look into, primarily because there are some weird aspects to it that I think get overlooked because people hope it's some kind of paranormal experiment, Barry, is what went on in Skull in the 90s.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Primarily because this was a monumental undertaking, really, in the modern era. It's a really sort of focused, long-term plan to try and create things. And it's very interesting that from what it seemed to start out at, ends up getting some kind of very strange communications towards the end, which would lead you to think that whatever they were speaking to certainly wasn't paranormal. It was clearly some other kind of communication. Once again, as you kind of indicate, your belief is that perhaps, once again, this is something from beyond the veil reaching forwards.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, within the Skull experiments, we also got photographs and video footage of greys that out to the seance room. And what pained me greatly was that that they were being forced to work in almost zero light conditions because the spirits wanted it. Now, if we go back far enough, we see that that there was a series of investigations conducted by Livermore Laboratories in the United States, and they had exceptionally weird encounters that almost mimicked the Skull experiments. The appearance of strange animals, the appearance of arms with no bodies attached. Items would materialize and dematerialize in front of their eyes. But this was all in daylight. So why are the Skull forced to work in darkness? Again, there's that trickster element that seems to come through. There was an experiment conducted in the 1970s, and that was by the students in the University of Indiana. And this was a precursor to Stephen Greer's CE5, in which they wanted to try and see if they could understand this phenomenon without truly understanding it to begin with. And they made contact with these nocturnal lights on several occasions. You see people nowadays, they'll use lasers, they'll flash up and these things flash back and everything else, or they'll use flashlights or have your torches if we're on this side of the Atlantic. And these things flash back at them. Now that was established. And like the Livermore Laboratories in the United States, the students began to experience rapping sounds in their homes. Hollow, disembodied voices, furious pounding on the walls, and physical attacks by unseen entities. Some experienced awakening in the night to find strange, dark-clothed men standing in their apartments. So, this phenomena has many different masks, and we can make contact with it by intent. And if the intent is strong enough, you can make that attachment. You can open that door to allow that to happen. And the skull experiment was no different. The mediums there that were working. Yes, there were some questions about why they wouldn't let the rooms be investigated and things like that. But I do know people who have investigated these mediums and trusted them. So I have to take their word for it. That they were able to do what they were able to do. And this phenomena appeared and did what was written about in school in the 1990s.
It's very interesting for you when you have certain aspects and certain cases and certain investigations like this, Barry, where there seems to be some kind of hangover where the participants will leave wherever they're doing their experimentations and something seems to follow them, as you were referring to there. And there are some very strange cases over the years. The Hexham Heads is another one which has never really sort of been conclusively explained away, of what these strange little heads were, what they meant, where they came from. Somebody said, oh yeah, well, I made them. So they said, well, can you make them again? And they just looked nothing like what he said he'd done. It's one of those, I think, where somebody wanted a bit of free publicity and probably wish they'd never said it. But people that were investigating that, Barry, were obviously claiming that they were being awoken by some large wolf-like creature that was terrifying them. And yet, we're talking about rational archaeologists and scientists here. These are not the people who were looking for the paranormal. As far as they were concerned, they were dealing with some kind of lost memento from British civilizations of the past and had no idea that these strange little heads had some kind of paranormal power, it would seem. I think
it's at a time that we have to realize that our idea of science is somewhat narrow, because there are aspects of the scientific and engineering fields that are exploring the esoteric undertones within this phenomena. And no more so than I've spoken with this before about the Douglas Aeronautics Company, who in 1968 were using a Ouija board to contact aliens, to get a jump start on understanding UFO engine design. Now that was official. I have the report, and I've looked through it, and there were red flags that were being raised throughout it. Because it was something. If we go back and have a look at what was coming through our oracles, for instance, in Greece, the Oracle of Delphi and whatnot, we have a variety of topics that were being conversed with these beings from the other side that give us advice on sociology, government, economics, warfare, crime, medicine, engineering, and science. And when we step forward, we look at what was happening in 1968 in that particular engineering group. These particular things, who always spoke to them in English, without exception, we started conversing with them on topics such as sociology, government, economics, warfare, crime, etc., etc., etc. The exact same thing what they were doing back in Greece 2,000 years before. We really have to wonder what on earth is going on. And our vision is short-sighted. And that's where I'd find that even within our science, it's short-sighted. We have history books, we have accounts, we have manuscripts that speak of our ancestors' encounters with these things, yet we choose to ignore them. And we base it on, well, what can I learn? And within this short space of time that I'm here on this planet, I'm ignoring everything else that was before, because that was all superstition. But yet here I am, working a Ouija board, contacting alleged aliens, looking for engine designs, which never came through. They never, ever give them the tech that they wanted, because the connections always, strangely enough, like a bad BT cell phone, always seemed to break down. and they always lost contact. But there was a great line from a fellow researcher, R.W. Bush, who he wrote a piece on UFOs caught in the web of deception. And to sum it up, he said, the true shepherd goes through the main gate instead of jumping over the fence. The real homeowner walks through the front door instead of climbing through the window. And the man who wants to tell us the truth, even if he comes from another planet, broadcasts it openly instead of whispering it into the ears of helpless captives in the middle of the night. That sums up the phenomena beautifully.
Absolutely. Well, it's a deeply thought-provoking book, Barry. You should be very proud of it.
Thank you.
It's a welcome addition to your canon of work. So, for you, my friend, what have you got coming up? I know, as we were referring to earlier, things are beginning to seem normal in the modern era. So, I would imagine that your year has started to fill up, and you've got plenty of things on your plate as you to dive into the rest of 2022.
Yeah, there are investigative channels that are opening up now, and we do have. We're working at the minute, planning on an expedition to understand the site of a particular portal. So all hands on deck for that one. And it'll be a tricky one, but I'm looking forward to it. And I'm also appearing at Awakenings on I think it's June the 24th, I believe, until the 26th. I'm looking forward to that, where I'll be speaking about the deceptions of gods and men, and meeting up with a lot of folks there. I love meeting people. And I always make time to set people down. If they make a beeline for me, or they've got a story to tell, I'll always set the time aside to listen. And I love hearing other people's encounters with this phenomenon.
Fantastic. And I believe you've got another project, hopefully in the pipeline, involving EVPs, is it, Barry?
EVPs? Oh, yes. Oh, you've been doing your homework. Yes, there's experiments that are going on at the moment with groups around the UK, around the British Isles, I should say. And that's on EVP. That's helping us understand and really, really narrowing the beam of light on the particular entity or being that's coming through the veil. So that's what that experiment, that series of experiments is about. So that's still ongoing. And I'm looking forward to getting to the end of that one and seeing what the outcome is. I suspect I know already what the outcome is, but we need to go through all the data first.
Fabulous. So where can everybody get a copy of your latest book, Barry, and keep up to date with your upcoming projects and work?
If they pop over to Amazon, it's available in hardback, softback, audiobook, and ebook. So in all formats. And they can reach out to me on Facebook, and if they wish to send me a message or two, and also people can jump over onto my website charmstealer.com, where they can see some of the other books.
Fabulous. Barry, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure finally speaking with you. I hope I get the opportunity to speak to you again, and I wish you all the very best for the rest of the year in your upcoming exciting adventures.
Thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate it.